right, as we see some of our attendees still coming in, I just wanted to give a quick welcome to everyone to our Global Sport Matters live show in this new year, which kind of feels like an extension of 2020 still. But in this new year, and especially in this conversation today, we are looking forward to really moving the discussion from acknowledgement into action, and are really looking forward to our panel today, looking forward to the topic at hand, which is tough conversations for 2021 and really beyond that. Before we begin, like always, just want to give a few different details at the very top, just a couple housekeeping things. We are recording this session and we'll make it available to you all afterwards. We are also live streaming the show right now on our Twitter page at Global Sport Matters. That's Global Sport MTRS, and encourage everyone on the call with us today to engage with us both in social media, as well as on the call today here on the show. So feel free to follow us if you don't already. We will be dropping some great information in the chat box throughout the conversation, including some links to have you follow not only us here at Global Sport Matters and the Institute, but also our wonderful panel today too. Here in the conversation, we encourage you to use the Q&A box, and any questions and comments that you have for our panel, please drop those there throughout the conversation. We would also like to take a moment to acknowledge the lands which the Global Sport Matters, which is a part of Global Sport Institute at Arizona State University. The lands that we are operating from sit on the ancestral lands of the Pima and Maricopa peoples. And in this new year, the Institute, we are proud to present our new annual theme. This theme, like all of our previous themes, guides our conversations, our research, really guides how we're exploring sport. And just like always, we never quite close the book on previous themes. So as you'll see, we are intermixing intersectionally previous themes into this new one, which is sex, gender, and sexuality. So we'd like to present this in our newest video to kind of give you a little taste of just what we're exploring within this topic. So let's go ahead and start that video.
The Global Sport Institute is a research institute where diverse disciplines converge to thoughtfully examine critical issues impacting sport, and then trying to push for everything from policy to interventions and applications that will impact the world and make it better for everyone. We organize ourselves around a different theme each year. Our current theme is sex, gender, and sexuality in sport. We're trying to galvanize the researchers from around the globe, global partners, and folks who are artists, folks who are dealing with policy, folks who are making decisions in terms of apparel. We really want to open this up as a way of really trying to get a picture from each place, to have a deep conversation about sex, gender, and sexuality in sport.
It's essential that leadership in every sport establish a culture of respect.
Allows us to explore from multiple different areas and examine a little bit more of maybe the behind the scenes, of working in sport.
Sport should be opportunity for self-growth, healthy competition, community, and affirmation. It should be an opportunity for all genders, all sexualities to be able to thrive, to learn about themselves, to learn from each other, to collaborate.
When it comes to understanding sex, gender, and sexuality in sport, we have to realize that these things and these classifications do not occur in a silo.
Landmark ruling against Olympic gold medalist Caster Semenya.
She will not be able to compete in the 400 and the 800 meters and in the 1500 meters.
Sport is a microcosm of life, but also sport has the ability to influence life.
It's hard to be what you can't see, so let's look at representation on all fronts, including social media, storytelling, marketing, in the office, on staff, who's in leadership positions.
Hearing that chant at the end was so special. People really do believe that, what we fight for is what is needed amongst the whole world.
Masculinity can be really negative force in these contexts of kind of everyday men's sport.
We need to commit to creating and sustaining more inclusive and diverse school sport context where all girls feel like they belong.
We can make a difference by working together to improve access to education, access to equipment and training facilities, and unfair pay or career growth opportunities.
This is a time for us to work individually and collectively for change on our teams and in the world.
Let's have some dialogue about how we in the sports community can not only help athletes live and be their authentic selves, but also help others to support and accept that we all show up differently, looking differently, behaving differently, and that's okay.
2 transgender high school runners, well, they're kicking up dust in Connecticut, leaving parents wondering if they have an unfair advantage.
So the more conversation we have, the more we will be able to build understanding and create a sports world that is more inclusive for everyone.
These 3 things represent who we are as people, the things that make us uniquely beautiful and different. And why this matters now is because we are becoming a more interconnected global community. And we are discovering more about different societies, cultures, and point of views. And so this year, we're going to explore these topics so we can have a better global understanding, and most importantly, enhance our global community and bring us together.
We are amplifying the power of sport. We have a unique opportunity to learn from each other and from those who are making progress. We are inviting industry leaders, decision makers, scholars inside and out of sport to look at what their discipline is doing and then to use that as a starting point for thinking of what that might mean in terms of sport.
Because understanding
Sport matters.
So throughout the year, you're going to see our annual theme coming through our conversations. We'll be exploring this on our digital platform, Global Sport Matters, and like I said, through our research as well. So in each of these conversations and as well today, you will see our theme coming up and being a part of the conversation. So with that, I would love to turn it over to our host for today to lead our conversation, Dr. Scott Brooks, who is sociologist and director of research for the Global Sport Institute. Scott, take it away.
Thank you, Kendall. Good day to everyone. Really excited for the conversation that we're going to have today. I'll do just quick name introductions, and then as we move through, I'll give you a little bit more specifics about the guests that we have. So first, we have Ashlyn Johnson with us. And, Ashlyn is president of the Inclusion Playbook. And we'll talk and learn a little bit more about the Inclusion Playbook and what she's been doing there. We have Jeremy Goldberg, and Jeremy Goldberg is president and quarterback of League Apps. It's a wonderful new platform and application that is out, and it's something that has really been thriving during this pandemic and this time. And then we also have Dr. Wilsa Charles Malveaux, right? And with Dr. Wilsa Charles, she is a psychiatrist. She's someone that has been working with folks, and I'll say with athletes, giving us tips on things that we can do to improve. I really, when I looked and learned a little bit more about Dr. Wilsa, I'm going to go ahead and dub her our LinkedIn psychiatrist, right? You go into LinkedIn and she's always providing these helpful tips for us. So welcome everyone. We're happy to have you here and excited to have this conversation. We really are trying to bridge these ideas with action. And so the 3 topics for these difficult conversations today are talking about, we want to focus on youth sports, we want to look at mental health and well-being, and we want to look at diversity, equity, inclusion. So welcome everyone for being with us. I'm gonna start with, thinking about youth sport. So with youth sport, we know that there's always been these disparities, whether there's disparities between girls and boys in their sports participation. Also in terms of access, we know that there's disparities, or we're learning more, right? We haven't always paid attention to the disparities when we're talking about LGBT youth. and how they are entering sports and their experiences within sport. We know that with this pandemic, we're seeing a deepening of the haves and the have-nots, right? So the tough times that our country is facing and the globe is facing, we're really seeing how this pandemic is exacerbating some of these known issues and problems. I want to start with Jeremy to talk about what your app does and how it is not only providing a valuable resource for youth sports, but how you're also bridging this gap to help those communities that don't have the resources to really provide critical sports opportunities for you.
Yeah, well, first of all, Scott, thanks for having me. And it's congrats on the work of the Institute. Maybe I'll start by starting a little higher level, even before I get into league apps, by simply observing that before you have a conversation about equity, one of the things that can help you appreciate why that inequity matters is to appreciate the power of sport. Right? And so someone like Nelson Mandela, and that famous quote about the power of sports to change the world. And I'm honored that Benita Fitzgerald-Mosley, who used to be the CEO of Laureus Sports for Good, where Mandela said those words at the first award ceremony, is my colleague and head of community impact in our philanthropic efforts at League Apps. When Mandela says something like that, and we believe that sports has such power, right? As Mandela talked about, to bridge racial barriers, to remind us at a time of division of our common humanity, all the benefits that happen from a mental health and physical well-being, the way it prepares you for a future as leaders. I think there's a stat among others that Aspen put out that you'll have 7 to 8% higher earnings if you play youth sports over the course of your life if you participate. So if sports is so much goodness, then all of a sudden that inequity becomes a moral imperative to want to solve that, right? Because it's something that's so important. How can you deny something that's so important to so many? And the stats are staggering when you can kind of consider about the kind of inequity in youth sports. Just one example, pre-pandemic, which to your point has only gotten worse. If you were in a household income, you're in a household where the income was less than $25,000. Between 2012 and 2019, the participation rate for kids under 12 that played sport on a regular basis dropped from about 34% to about 22.7%, right? A dramatic drop. So only 1 in 5 households were playing sport. During that same period, if your household had an income over 100,000, you were participating almost at 50%, and you dropped about 44%. And so one is you basically are not only are kids who are from underserved communities, from lower income communities, not having that opportunity, but that crisis was worsening prior to the pandemic, right? A situation that's only been exacerbated. So the final part to answer the whole context of the question is where League Apps comes in. You can view us as the operating system and the community for the youth sports industry. And so all of the ways that organizations are operating, running their camps and their clinics and their leagues and their teams, the way that they're managing those operations and those experiences is happening through our application that's powering websites and mobile engagement and everything else. But as we build our business, we realize that if that inequity exists, we have to think about strategies to make sure that that's available to everybody. So we have a commitment to impact 500,000 kids over 3 years. We're a year into that commitment. We've hit about 175,000 kids through provision of our technology, where we make that available for free, in addition to cash and other support for underserved sports-based or communities, organizations serving underserved communities. We also partner with professional leagues and teams. So for example, MLB's RBI program, Reviving Baseball in Inner Cities, provides our technology that allows us to build capacity of organizations and capture the data that allows the Major League Baseball and their affiliates to best serve those communities as well. And that's a commitment we take really seriously as we build our business.
And that's, it's critically important to be able to provide that basic infrastructure, right? I've coached on some youth teams, and just trying to get a team organized, trying to figure out where you're going. There's fantastic reports of how you've been helping out these different teams and organizations, and even grants that you've been giving out. I'm going to circle back with you on in terms of those grants that you're giving out. I want to turn to Ashlyn now. So, Ashlyn, when we think about where we've come in terms of our understanding of communities, and particularly youth, groups of youth who are being excluded, one of the things that's now so much a part of sport, but I think people are not realizing, is really this. There's growing policy, there's growing legislation that is under the framework of this idea of saving women's sport. I want you to talk to us a little bit about that and what's going on and what we should be aware of as we hear more about this campaign.
Yes, you are absolutely right. A lot of these new bills that we're seeing are under the guise of saving women's sports. That's literally their names: the Save Women's Sports Acts, the same Save Women and Girls Sports Act. We see them at the federal level and the state level. What these bills essentially do is they ban trans youth from participating in sports. They target trans girls, but can also target trans boys and trans girls. And again, they essentially make it just illegal for you to allow a trans girl to participate on a team consistent with their gender identity. Like some of these states even have $10,000 fines if an official allows a trans girl to play on a girls' team. And we know these bills are not about women's sports. We've seen so many cis women speak out about, like, if you really care about women's sports, here's what we need. We need better pay. We need better facilities. We need more visibility on TV. What we don't need to do is go after trans youth. And so it is in some ways disheartening to see these bills pop up across the country. It was 18 last year. The legislatures have only been open for 2 weeks. We've already seen 8 more of these bills. But what is actually very encouraging is seeing more and more cis women and pro women speak out in support of these young trans athletes who just want to play.
Yeah, one of the things that has drawn a lot of attention. There's, I remember the young woman in New Jersey, track runner, and I'm thinking of what it must feel like to be a young person and to get this kind of attention, right? And when we add the dynamics of, when we think intersectionally about this, whether we're adding race, and that's the case of the young woman out of Jersey, if we're talking about class, these have even longer term impacts. So, Dr. Charles, when we're thinking about youth and them navigating this space of youth sports, and particularly around diversity, equity, inclusion, what are some of the things that we should be thinking about? What are some of the if I'm a parent, how do I want to protect my child? How should I? If I'm a coach, what are some of the things that we can do?
I think that one thing that's really important is very simple, which is just listening to them, talking to them. A lot of children, most children, they don't have the language or the understanding to really bring these things up on their own. They're not going to feel comfortable necessarily approaching adults being a child. There's a lot for them to kind of figure out on their own, and they need our support in doing that. So I think one mistake that people often make is they feel like some topics are just too taboo. And so let's just not deal with it and then they'll be fine. But they're living this experience whether we talk to them about it or not. So really spending the time to understand how they're feeling, where they're coming from, I think that's the first step. Also recognizing that with all these challenges, whether it's the pandemic and them losing their ability to participate, or the issues that we just were talking about, figuring out, are we seeing signs that they're already being emotionally affected? So in some ways it looks similar to adults. They might have less of an appetite. They might not be sleeping as well. They might be more irritable. But also for kids, it can be more complicated. They might all of a sudden start regressing in terms of how they behave and acting like a younger child, or all of a sudden start saying they don't want to participate in school and they're not going to log in for these Zoom calls. And this is someone who previously really enjoyed being in school. So noticing those signs so that you can see if this is somebody that you need to actually get connected with mental health services, that's also very important. And also within their control is kind of keeping them in a schedule as much as possible. With this pandemic, especially, there's been a loss of that structure that's helpful to so many children. So if we can recreate some sort of schedule to try to create an environment of some sense of normalcy for them, that can also be very helpful for them in keeping them connected to others, their teammates, their coaches, their friends, in the ways that we can do it safely. That'll all help to support their mental health in this time.
Yeah, thank you for that. I when I look at, if you look at league apps and you see there's some case studies there, you've got coaches that are giving their stories about how they've been able to manage their teams more effectively. One of my concerns has been looking at inner city, looking at our under-resourced communities, looking at our Black and brown communities in particular, knowing how this pandemic has really ravaged Black and brown communities. And so I've been worrying about, where are our coaches? Where will they be when we get to the end of the pandemic? You know, in certain areas, we call them old heads. And if they literally are older, we know that we may have lost the number, right? We're not at the point where we've been able to really do an assessment of our losses as of yet. But Jeremy, as I'm thinking about that, right, I wonder how League Apps fits in, right? Because you're the infrastructure, but you're also playing a role in trying to increase access. So talk a little bit about fun play. Talk to us about how you're trying to increase those opportunities, so that more, as once we come out of this pandemic, how are we going to get kids back to playing this game that brings them this belonging, this connectedness that Dr. Charles spoke about?
Yeah, one thing, as I think about our efforts, I think the first thing I'd say is locating our efforts in the context of a larger movement, especially in the context of youth sports. And I think the first thing to recognize is, one, that the systemic issues that exist in our society, those are simply then reflected within the institutions of youth sports, right? And so as you're thinking about confronting those issues of privilege and power and inequity and the economic structures, those things manifest itself within youth sports, in addition to the idea that youth sports itself has a forms of systemic racism, discrimination, and inequity too. I think the second thing is that because it's a systemic issue in youth sports, right? The question of the access and equitable nature of the experiences, the quality of the experiences, it defies any easy solution, right? We can tell you what's wrong, right? We can show the data that certain kids aren't having access to it, whether it's based on gender or sexual orientation, right? Or race or income, whatever it may be. But it's not just a simple solution. And because of that, it requires a systemic approach. And when I see systemic level change, I really think about the three levers of being institutional level change. That's policy. You've got norm-based change, where you're basically shifting how society is thinking about these things. And in the case of youth sports, a move away from a scarcity model where playing sports is about scholarships, right? It's about preferential admission to schools, in which case the less people in the system, the better off you are, because keeping that out makes it easier to access those benefits, to where youth sports is about life, right? It's about life skills, in which case the diversity and inclusion enriches the experience. It gives you the benefits of that experience as well. And then those norms impact both providers and parents and how they think about that. And then lastly, the market, right? The role that organizations within the system of youth sports and how they're approaching this as well. So when I think about League Apps, one is we've helped launch and I help co-chair the first coalition in youth sports, the Play Sports Coalition, really. And this is something that's both advocating on Capitol Hill about what needs to happen, both for relief for the industry, especially because some of the things that have happened don't help nonprofits. They don't help youth sports organizations that don't have payroll because they have, or significant payroll because they're 1099 or volunteer based. So they're not eligible for that relief. So that policy lens is one thing. And the second is how do we collectively raise our voices about the importance of sports? And then the final part is what League Apps can do, right? Is in addition to helping lead an industry-wide effort in which we're just part of that, it's our own contributions through our Fun Play program, which basically says that not only do you have organizations that need capacity, right? But they also usually can't afford the technology in which they need it the most, right? That working family or that single family, if they don't know that the game is being rained out or it's not playing and they leave work, but it didn't happen because the organization has no way to effectively communicate, right? Or making it easy for those organizations to administer and run their programs. We've committed to providing, technology grants and capacity building grants and training to help those organizations kind of close that gap and deliver better programs. And we're proud of case studies working with organizations like America Scores. You get inspired by their work, seeing the Youth Poet Laureate yesterday and thinking about the power of poetry, and then thinking that there's a youth sports organization like America Scores that teaches you soccer and poetry at the same time, and realizing what we can do and the power of youth and the platform you can give them, if only for the opportunity. And so if we can save America Scores time, money, enable growth and through our technology and contribution, we'll do that in addition to them being part of the coalition that's really helping decision makers understand why it's so important.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, to think of how you're bringing, in some ways, just in that example, being a student athlete, right? A scholar and an athlete, bringing in poetry and mixing that with sport is really, really interesting and inspiring work. Ashlyn, when I think deeper about what's going on with youth. And we know that bullying happens not only at school, but also in sports. We know that bullying happens whether it's around gender, whether it's around race. We don't pay as much attention to whether how it's happening around gender identity or whether how it's going on in terms of sexual identity. We know the rates are higher, right? If you study it and look deeper, what are some of those issues that we really need to be thinking about when we're talking about youth, LGBT youth in general, and then trans youth in particular? And are there some things that we can do at the local levels, right? There's the campaigns, the big political stuff that maybe some of us are thinking that has nothing to do with us. What can we do close? What can we do in our own leagues?
Well, some of the bigger issues that we need to worry about when it comes to LGBTQ youth in sports. One is actually like participation, which is what we've been talking about. We know that the average rate of sports participation throughout the country is 68% for youth who do not identify as LGBTQ. It's 24% for LGBTQ youth or LGB youth. For trans youth, that number drops significantly. The trans girls are only participating at 14%. Trans boys are only participating at 12%. So we're seeing huge gaps in participation. And so then the question becomes, once trans athletes are allowed to participate, or once even lesbian, gay, or bisexual athletes are allowed to participate, what type of culture are they coming into? What type of language are the coaches using? We know that I think it's 4 out of 5 LGBT athletes are not out to their coaches. So you have the issue of you never want a coach to assume who's on their team, but a lot of times coaches won't act until they see that they have an out player. And so it's just getting people into that mindset of not assuming and creating safe and welcoming cultures for these athletes. Because what you don't want to do is have someone in sports for all the benefits of sports, but they end up leaving that space broken because of all of the pressures and all of the rejection that they might face in sport. So those are some of the like bigger issues that we're dealing with. Again, it's participation, just getting people into the sports space. And then when you get them there, making sure that they have the support they need to stay there and to like reap all the benefits that sports has to offer. When it comes to what we can do at the local level, a lot of these bills are in places you would not imagine. We all imagine they're going to be in Tennessee. Like they're just going to be in the South. That's the South is passing these bills. That is not true. We've seen them in Rhode Island. We've seen them in Washington State. Whenever you see one of these bills pop up, call your local congressperson. Actually put in the time to say that this is important to you, because a lot of time these bills are sliding through simply because people won't say anything. Other things you can do is your state or your local high school association, let them know about the policies that you want to see or the trainings that you would like to have. Because a lot of times what we see is everyone really wants to do the right thing. They just don't have the training to do it. They don't know what the right thing is. So if we encourage our local, not only lawmakers, but administrators in the high school associations to do the right thing and to give them the resources they need to do the right thing, usually they will. And then for people who are playing rec sports, it's important to know your rights. Like I'm a trained civil rights attorney, so I'm always big on when all else fails, know your rights. If you can't convince someone to do it because it's the right thing, know the law. And for some of these public accommodation sports that are run by the city, they're located in places that have laws that protect LGBTQ people. And so you might be in Georgia, but you might be in Atlanta, Georgia. If you're in Atlanta, Georgia, there are things that you don't have to put up with in terms of LGBTQ discrimination. So lastly, it's just being aware of what your rights are.
Thank you so much. And we're going to build on that because there's so much new coaching education, but we're so behind. We're just emphasizing gender and really cisgender kind of education, more specific to, to what we're saying is just girls. We're not thinking about LGBT. And so we need to have deeper conversations. Right now, we're going to roll to our first poll and then we'll come back. So Kendall, why don't you talk to us about the poll that we have so that we can invite folks to continue to put questions into the chat, but also to engage with us in this poll, and then we'll come back with our second segment.
Absolutely. So kind of bringing it back out, I'm launching the poll right now. we're bringing it back out, kind of going off of how Jeremy set this scene here, looking at participation. So thinking about coming out of the pandemic, do you think we will see a rise in youth sport participation? Because obviously not everybody has been able to participate. It's been really difficult, you know, whether you're trying to do it virtually or you're lucky enough or privileged enough to be able to participate in person still. So while we're doing that, we did have an audience question that I would love to throw to you, Ashland. This is from Carolyn. She asks, as an advocate for all women in sport in the areas you promote, how do I examine and keep from getting baited by framing of these inequitable policies and be aware of the organizations and people that are promoting policies that I don't want to be complicit in? So I'm going to pop that into the live there if you want to think about that and give us your take.
Sorry, did you put that in the chat?
So it's in the Q&A box for you.
Oh, the Q&A box. Okay, great. Sorry, give me 1 second here. These framings are seductive. It's very easy to get lost in the trans girl, trans woman versus cis girl, cis woman conversation. That's why a lot of times they're being used by very conservative people who don't really have an interest in women's sports. These are people who consistently vote down new sports for under Title IX. These are people who consistently are okay with the fact that we have way few women's coaches across the board, but they know this framework is very enticing. So if you do find yourself being baited by the framework, don't be too hard on yourself, because it's being used because it's very, very successful. Just if you hear it and you have a visceral reaction, I would say pause and actually think about what you're being asked. And what you're being asked is to decide between basically the dignity and value of two types of human beings in the space of sport. And once you start thinking about it in those terms, you'll realize that what you're being offered with is a zero-sum game when sports doesn't work like that. It doesn't mean that just because a trans athlete can play, that all of a sudden a cis girl is going to lose her spot. That's just not how sports work. If we have more people wanting to participate in sports, you create more sports opportunities. So I think it's important to actually just be aware of that whenever you're being in any political conversation being presented with a zero-sum game. And that's what it, like, if you make this decision, then all this bad stuff happens. Just pause and think about that, because really you can just add more sports. And I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share our results from the poll. So coming out of the pandemic, do you think we will see a rise in youth sport participation? 50% of you are in agreement. Yes, we will see a rise. So that's some good hope right there. So turn it back over to you, Scott.
All right, thanks, Kendall. And I think that the question that Ashlyn answered speaks to Jeremy's point about that idea of scarcity, right? That, you know, instead of us thinking of the scarcity of opportunities, we need to think more about the opportunities for more youth to participate. Jeremy, you look like you had something to add to that.
Yeah, well, I think that's right, and I think it's important to understand when you're thinking about youth sports. If you think about it as a marketplace, right? You've got a supply and demand. So if you're answering that question from the demand perspective, I think that there are a lot of people that, especially people who have been cooped up with their kids, that haven't had access, and there's so much, so many of the difficulties that's created. I think there's going to be a demand for kids to get out there and play, for people to appreciate what they're missing. The hope is, though, then the supply, right? Are there the organization? Are there the programs that are inclusive, that are quality, that are available to them to meet that demand? And that's the important thing. And that's the part that, if we're not intentional about it, those programs won't be there. The quality programs won't be there to make sure we're addressing that. And what we can expect is, given the economic situation, the budgets are cut, and the communities that are most marginalized are going to be the most affected. And just to illustrate that point, there was a last-minute decision that happened on Tuesday that was brought to my attention this morning, where there was a specific the specific Outdoor Recreation Legacy Partnership Program, ORLP, was a program that basically makes grant for wilderness as part of the Wilderness Protection kind of Act. And basically, at the last minute, they rescinded this order that basically made $125 million available to fund grants to help support urban areas that have access to outdoor spaces such as parks and playgrounds. And so the communities that need access the most, especially communities of color, lower income communities, are the ones that are most hurt by this decision that happened in the middle of the night on Tuesday night where they rescinded this order. So with the Aspen Institute, others that are launching kind of a petition, I'll make sure I share it with Rachel and others to put that out. It's like, this is the kind of stuff that happens if we're not paying attention and we're not focusing on the supply of opportunities, infrastructure and spaces, because the demand is there. So it's up to us collectively to meet it.
No, thank you for that. That's important information. I can see Ashlyn is shaking her head. We've got to get on that. So please include that information. If you can put it into the chat so that we can all participate and take a close look at that. You know, as we talk about the demand, one of the things we know, we have a pay for play model. And so part of what operates is people are really thinking about sport for mobility. They're thinking about what this does for their kids in terms of extra opportunities. They're not thinking about it collectively as a right for all children, for all youth, to be able to be physically active, to be able to socialize, to be able to exert themselves physically and learn more about themselves. So, you know, Dr. Charles, one of the things that I took from one of your articles, you talked about feeling your heart going out to those athletes where their institution is no longer funding their sport. You highlighted those athletes who maybe lost their chance to compete because their sport was canceled. You talked about those who were eagerly awaiting their senior years, those who were eagerly awaiting their debut, right? All who got their opportunities cut short by the pandemic. Tell us about, you know, how we overcome these premature exits. So, you know, there's a sports participation piece to this, thinking of how do we get more access for athletes who are not jumping in, who are feeling excluded, who are not supported. Where now, if we listen to what Ashlyn has said, there's also thinking about what happens when you're inside a sport, not wanting to cause that harm. What about this exit from sport? What's some of the advice you give?
Absolutely. You know, I think that it's important to recognize, I mean, for so many people have to deal with an exit for sport regardless. It's coming for everyone at some point in time. And for most people, you don't get to pick when that is. Now, this pandemic, of course, hit all of us by surprise. So that came much sooner for people who might not have been planning on this being their year to be done. Understanding that that's going to cause some deep feelings, especially for athletes that have been participating in their sport for a long time. And you don't have to be an older person to have that experience. I mean, some sports you're peaking in your late teens, and you might have been involved with it since you were in single digits, 4 years old even. So recognizing that at that point it's become part of that person's identity, and having to separate from that is going to cause some issues. It's going to cause some feelings to come up that they might not be familiar with. It's really similar to grief. Grief when we've lost a loved one. I talked earlier about some of the grief responses that we might see in adults and children as well. But recognizing that this is a normal occurrence. If it happens, it's not something that signifies that you're somehow weak, that you're having this experience, having to leave your sport. But also to recognize that if it's getting more serious, if you're being impaired to the point where you're not able to function, you find yourself crying all the time, depressed, anxiety, you can't do your other work, your job, if you're a working person, or if you're struggling in school now because of this, then it's time to get help. So I think that part of recognizing those signs that you need the extra help is also key when you have these transitions. The other thing that I want people to keep in mind is that we've talked so much already about how sports is such a microcosm of life. There are a lot of lessons that we all get from sports participation, people watching sports even, but even more for the athletes that are in it. You take that with you. It's not over. So it may or may not be the end of your participation in sports altogether with this happening. But even if it is, the things that you've gained from your sport, the lessons that you've learned from it, the connections you've made with your coaches, with your teammates, all of those things are things that you can take into your future. And a lot about this transition is about learning how to pivot and turn that into something that works to your benefit moving forward.
Yeah, and I really encourage folks to look up, your article, Overcoming Premature Exits in Sport. You talk about how your career can bleed into your next part of your life, right? And that hangover. I love that concept, right? The hangover. Tell us a little bit about that idea of the hangover that athletes might feel as they're exiting.
That hangover identity. I mean, sometimes it's hard, even if you have a new opportunity. Even if you've moved on to a new field in your life, let's say it was a collegiate athlete that had already planned to go to law school or some such other profession, you might still have a hard time separating from who you felt like you were as an athlete. Knowing that that is okay, but also announcing that you're making these changes to the people that you trust can help you to kind of make that separation so that you're not hanging on to the what ifs. You're not feeling that it's a failure as opposed to just a new phase in your life. I'm understanding that a lot of what we go through in life really could be thought of as kind of a head fake. You thought you were in it to get a certain outcome, but actually it's preparing you for something else. And when you open yourself up to that possibility, you're better able to use those experiences to your advantage moving forward.
Yeah, no, I think that really helps to bring a lot of what we've been talking about together. Your earlier comments and Ashlyn's comments about talking, right? Us being able to communicate, listen to our young folks who are participating in sport, and then you also have the aspect of Jeremy working with one of these programs, and they're bridging, starting to introduce things outside of sport. As we've been
Yes.
looking at this post-sport journey, we know that athletic identity, right? You can have that identity foreclosure, and our kids learn early on. I'm just focusing in on sport. I put all of my eggs in that one basket, but that only makes this worse, right? When you get to the end of your career, what can you do if you've never been thinking about things outside of sport? So I think that's really central. I want to just ask you one last question that really struck me, and that was the idea of gratitude. That in how we might cope better, you talked about practicing gratitude, and I wanted to get specifics. Like, what does that look like to practice gratitude? What could that tip be? Because I feel like that can be something effective throughout a young person's athletic career. To practice gratitude maybe takes things down a little bit, right? Everyone isn't going to be Serena Williams or Simone Biles. So maybe that gives us a little bit more perspective, but give us some practical ideas about this practicing gratitude.
Absolutely. So, in the practice of gratitude, it can look like different things. It may be written practice of gratitude. I often advise people to have a gratitude journal. If you have a notebook, any notebook will do, or you can just use a regular piece of paper or even notepad apps in your phone. But just getting into that habit, whether you actually put it down, which I think really helps to reinforce it in your brain, or if this is just a meditation that you do every morning when you get up, or every night before you go to bed, or sometimes people do it twice a day. It really helps to set the framework for where your mind is, what you're going to be thinking about. I mean, how many times have you gone to bed thinking about something, worrying about something, and as soon as you wake up in the morning, it's right back there on your mind? So, practicing gratitude is an opportunity for us to kind of take better control over the thoughts that we're having and really think about what it is that you're thinking about, and gearing that towards what you want to think about, what you want to focus on, how you want to feel, instead of all the automatic negative thoughts that can come into your mind very easily, especially when you're going through hard times. And everybody has something to be grateful for. And I tell people, even if that's only three things, that you woke up this morning, that you're still alive, that you can breathe, then write those three things down if that's all you have. But get in the habit of being aware and acknowledging the things that you do have to be grateful for. And that not only helps you in terms of your health and keeping stress down, but there's actually been studies that show that it helps with performance. And that's not just athletic performance. So again, we take these skills that we learn from sports and take it to life. So whether you're an athlete or a student or an executive, having these practices in place to keep your mind in a good space and not be so tossed back and forth by what's happening in the world and around you. These are useful skills to practice and to use.
God, I just want to interject. And first of all, I want to express some gratitude for you, Dr. Charles Mova, for sharing that. And I'm smiling because I for a few reasons. One, at the personal level, I have a gratitude practice every morning where I try to meditate and I try to think about 3 things I'm grateful for and 3 intentions of the day. And one of the things that inspired this is Tim Ferriss. If you've ever listened to his podcast, he's written a number of books, The 4-Hour Workweek, The 4-Hour Body. He did a book where he studied 250 of the highest achievers or performers across industry and sports and arts, whatever it may be. And he identified some of the common practices. And one of the most common was a morning routine where gratitude was an essential feature to the highest performing people that we might look at in society. So one is I want to echo that personally. But second of all is I think having a mindset about gratitude shifts the ego, right? It shifts the frame from it being about us to in an ego-centric mode to being about others, right? And all that we're approaching things, but then allows you to be a more effective teammate, right? So it works in sports, but it works in anything. So my company, next week we have an offsite and we have a gratitude exercise. I don't think anyone's listening from my company because we haven't actually told them this yet. So we're actually spending 6 hours breaking into groups. And the first part of it is how do we thank in different groups, 20 different organizations with a list with the most creative ways to just say thank you for organizing youth sports experiences, right? And what you're doing in the community, because these people, right, they're giving up nights and weekends, right? They're getting yelled at for parents about playing time and everything else. And so how do we express that gratitude? And we're going to basically have a contest for the most creative ways that they're coming up with thanking people. And this idea was inspired by, I'll post this talk by a guy named AJ Jacobs, who's an editor at large at Esquire, who wrote a book that was with the idea that if he could thank everybody involved in as a gratitude journey in something as simple as a cup of coffee. And so he literally ended up thanking 1,000 people connected with a single cup of coffee, from the barista to the people that in the farms in Costa Rica that made the beans, to the people that paved the roads that the beans were transported on, to the security guard at the warehouse where the beans were stored, and wrote an entire book about it and has an entire TED talk about gratitude and just appreciating that we take for granted all the things that go into a youth sports experience and everything else. And if we remember that, we appreciate it, that goes a long way to being able to take best advantage of those kinds of experiences. So anyway, I'm passionate about it. So I appreciate you asking.
Yes, no, I think that if we're looking at how do we increase access and equity, we have to be thinking not only about just the participation space or the exit, but we've got to be thinking of the whole career, right? So what happens when they're also inside of sport? Ashton, when in your amount of research and the people that you have worked with, are there some critical insights about the experiences of trans youth in particular that you might be able to give us as an opening for us to really do better when it comes to the experiences that trans youth? Because I'm thinking, we often think about role models. And so if there aren't enough role models, if people can't see themselves, then how do we expect them to take that risk, to take that chance? So maybe it's role models even that you might recommend that we share with others. But what are some of the things that we should be, that might help us if we're trying to help a young trans youth, encourage them to enter sport?
Role models are helpful. We know that LGBTQ youth are 5 times as likely to have a suicide attempt, but we also know that LGBTQ youth that have an accepting adult in their life are 40% less likely to have attempted suicide in the last year. So that's just having an accepting adult in your life is transformative, especially for LGBTQ youth. So even if you don't know which terms to use, if you aren't very comfortable with all the LGBTQ issues, it doesn't matter. Just being there and being supportive goes a long way.
That's fantastic. Kendall, we've got a second poll. Why don't you take us through that?
All right, thank you so much, panelists. That was really wonderful. Our second poll that we want to share with you all, that I'm launching right now, Thinking about moving forward, obviously we are seeing a rise in the need for resources, the acknowledgement of mental health resources. So our question to you all is, do you think that it should be a requirement for all athletes to participate in mental health training along with physical training? We've seen the Olympics have put together, I believe it's a task force that they've called it, around mental health, and they're actually sharing with the public widely how they get mentally prepared, how they kind of put themselves into these moments for success. And so thinking about coming out, especially pandemic, the uncertainty that our athletes have felt, and also just coaches and anybody around sport has felt with these starts and stops. This mental health and obviously right now it's looking at it in terms of coming to it when you need it, but we know that that's not always the first thing that athletes are able to do, is to really seek out those resources. So we'll give everybody just a quick minute there, and we will look here. All right, let's see if we have any more. All right, thank you, Carolyn. She says, in gratitude for y'all on all the resources. She'll be interacting with it after this session and lighting candles for everybody here too. Thanks so much, Carolyn. And I love the notion around gratitude. I think that that's something that's really achievable. It's something that we can all do, and it just kind of sets your mindset into a way that in all of these times, it kind of brings you back to the present. All right, we're going to go ahead and end this poll here. All right, so not surprisingly, we've got to the answer, do you think it should be a requirement for all athletes to participate in mental health training along with physical training? 54% of you said yes immediately. However, I will give the second response. 33% of you said depends on who is doing the training, which is also very important, right? So Dr. Charles Malvo, if you're doing it, I think we're all signed up.
Sounds good.
Back to you, Scott.
All right. So as in our final moments, I wanted to do as we typically do. I'm sure you all are familiar with this. You're all probably pros at doing this webinar stuff. Your final thoughts, and because we're at the beginning of this 2021, folks are really hopeful. What is it that you think is realistic, right? What can we do to make some of the long-term impacts that we're all seem to be pushing for, right? Or so many of us seem to be pushing for in youth sports. Maybe there's a direction you think we should be looking at. Maybe there's a direction where you're pushing your organization. But what are some of those things that we should be doing in this new year? I think I'm going to push it to Dr. Charles first. What are some of the things that we should be pushing for, or new practices? What are things that you can give us for this new year?
Well, I think it's important to think in terms of small things that we can do and bigger things. Some people might find the whole task daunting, but it's really not something that has to be tackled all at once. This is a marathon, not a sprint. So little things that we can do, like creating those inclusive spaces that we talked about, making sure that these are organizations that are actually embracing the different members that want to be a part of it and the diversity that there is, and recognizing the strength in having diversity in organizations. That's one thing that can happen. Whenever there is bullying or misconduct in any way, sexual misconduct, racial discrimination, also knowing resources. There is an organization called Safe Sport, started for the Olympic athletes, but also for all athletes. And if there is harassment, hazing, misconduct, any of those things, you can actually report these things to that organization to get help and support. So I think that can also help to make it a more comfortable environment. But the last thing I'll say is, as we think about big organizations and their roles and the heads of organizations and who's being selected for leadership, for coaches, for staff, medical staff, there needs to be a change there. It needs to be deliberate. There's not a lack of representation due to a lack of availability or talent among different minority groups. So these things need to be tackled. And if you have someone at the helm that doesn't ready to do that, then that might be your best indication that you need a new leader.
All right. Thank you for that. Jeremy, what do you have? What are your nuggets of wisdom for us?
My nuggets of wisdom. Well, I think it's always tough to follow, and I agree with everything that Dr. Charles Mavo said. One is when I shared that framework earlier of norms and institutions and markets that drive kind of systemic change. When I think about that in the context of youth sports and the levers to kind of push youth sports in the right direction, I think it starts with norms, right? It starts with an understanding and embracing that. And I think this conversation is an illustration of that. If we focus on the outcomes, right, all the things that happen from sport, as opposed to participation itself, it changes the way we think about it. Because once we understand what sports is about and what it offers, right, well beyond the journey of the game, right, but in terms of life, then that creates a way that you're not thinking in terms of scarcity, right? You're thinking in terms of abundance and inclusion. And you're also thinking about, what is the ways that you're delivering on those outcomes, because it suggests that the organizations, it's not just a question of X's and O's, right? It's a question of all the things that are connected to sports. So that norms-based work, stuff that we're trying to do through the Play Sports Coalition, I think is really important. And I think it's how we collectively tell that story and raise our voices so that anybody that's involved in that, parents that are making choices in kids, to the people that are providing it, to the policymakers, are embracing that. The second thing is from the perspective of a market. If the youth sports is so important, there's no training, there's no certification, there's no professional development in this world of youth sports that I think is really important. Because if we're talking, it's hard enough for them to figure out how to even coach the game and get certified that. When you're adding on an expectation of how they're thinking about mental health well-being, right? How they're thinking about teaching about gratitude, how they're thinking about diversity and inclusion, and bias and all those things, I think we have to recognize that the professionalization of youth sports is not a bad thing, right? The kids don't need to be professionals, but the people running the organizations do. And so I think a lot of the work we're doing at League Apps is really in the vein of focusing on building that professional community and really building up the industry. And then the final thing I think on a personal note is, I think we have to recognize that the people that right now are controlling and influencing institutions of youth sports are overwhelmingly white cisgender males, right? And I think what we have to recognize is that it starts with leaders that recognize their own privilege, their own power, their own biases, that are willing to do the work themselves. And if you can do the work yourself, then you can take your organizations and allow those organizations to be constructive. And then ultimately we start to do that together. So I think there's a huge amount of responsibility, myself included, have to do the work, right? To recognize that and to confront others who have that power and influence, for us to make a difference. Because to expect those that are marginalized or discriminated against to be the ones to solve it is not how that works, right? And I think what we've learned is that the responsibility falls on people like myself and others to do that work.
Thank you for that. And that rolls us perfectly into Ashlyn and what her work does. Her work is to really get at those different levels, but does not neglect looking at power and looking at those organizations. Ashlyn, and I'm not trying to force you into responding to that, but why don't you give us your nuggets and your final points?
We all know that last year with COVID, the sports world was hit hard. And we know the youth sports world was also rocked even harder. But what it also did was created this interesting opportunity for sports organizations to want to grow in different ways. So last year, more so than any other time, we were flooded with requests from national governing bodies to do DE&I training, to figure out how do they, when they can actually compete again, how do they make sure that they're using this time in the most productive way? So for 2021, I want to see that continue to happen. It has to happen at two different levels. On the policy level, I would love to see all national governing bodies do a policy audit. So much has changed in the last year, how we look at certain policy issues such as racial justice, even protest policies or LGBTQ inclusion. Policies that are in the NGBs don't reflect that. And so what I always say is like great culture, great practices stem from great policies. You have to start at the bones. So we want people to start doing those equity audits. And to echo what Jeremy said, the next level is training. People have to be trained in implicit bias. In the sports world, you haven't seen that happen as much as you have in other corporate spaces, but I'm seeing it happen more now, and I hope it continues in 2021.
Well, that's fantastic. And it's great to be able to wrap it up that way. Kendall, it looks like we've got 3 new people now to look at for 2021. So I'm going to go ahead and nominate these 3, Dr. Wilson Charles, Jeremy Goldberg, as well as Ashlyn Johnson. We really thank you for spending this time with us, helping us to get a better sense of what's going on with youth in sport, mental health, and diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you so much, panelists, for this conversation today. And like I said at the very beginning, this is definitely the launching point that we'll continue to have conversations around throughout the year, and including past themes and our annual theme of sex, gender, and sexuality in sport. So thank you, panelists. If you need to jump into the next thing on your schedule, I know that this is one of many things that you guys are in part of today. So thank you. And thank you to our host, Dr. Scott Brooks, who will be joining us for our next GSM Live, which will be on the NFL hiring trends. So we will be looking at research that Scott Brooks and our research team has done, looking at the Rooney Rule and the impact that it has made, the reality of that impact for hiring as far as diversity goes in the NFL. So we'll be promoting that to you all in just a little bit. But in the meantime, thank you everybody for joining us. And we will just drop a few more notes into the chat box here. But from all of us here at the Global Sport Institute and Global Sport Matters, thanks so much for joining us for our first conversation in 2021 on Tough Conversations for 2021. Thanks, everyone.